Hi everyone, welcome to episode 5 of my Gosford history series. Today we'll be looking at the Mount Peneng farm home for boys. This video does have a content warning containing material that is sometimes confronting and disturbing. Words or images can cause sadness or distress or trigger traumatic memories for people, particularly survivors of past abuse, violence or childhood trauma. The Gosford Farm Home for Boys was a reformatory established by the Department of Public Instruction in the early 1900s. This is what the department looked like in Sydney at that time. The site at Mount Peneng was selected by Mr. G.S. Beebe, the Minister for Public Instruction, and a committee including Sir Charles McKellar of the State Children's Relief Board and Frederick Stainer of Brush Farm Reformatory, because they considered the site to be healthy and with beautiful natural surroundings, good water, and sufficient land for cultivation. So Sir George Stephenson Beebe, KBE, now these letters after their names stand for titles that are connected with Freemasons, which is a common theme in a lot of the history that we look at. And it's everywhere, not just Gosford, but everywhere, all over the world. So Sir George Beebe, 1869 to 1942, was a founder of the Australian Labor Party in New South Wales and represented from 1907 to 1912. Afterwards, he served as an independent, a nationalist, and a progressive, and then joined the State Arbitration Court, where he was appointed to the Commonwealth Court of Conciliation and Arbitration and was then Chief Judge from 1939. And Sir Charles Kinnaird McKellar, KCMG, from 1844 to 1926, served in the New South Wales Legislative Council from 1885 to 1925, and he filled a casual vacancy in the Senate. He was also a surgeon and the father of the famous poet and writer Dorothea McKellar, who also has a title, Order of the British Empire. Frederick Arthur Stainer, in 1868, Foundation Master of the Masonic Rising Sun Lodge in 1911. Stainer began teaching in 1884. He organized the disciplinary system along a military line. A reformatory is an institution designed to remove criminal children from adult prisons, as well as to separate them from neglected children. The name reflects the notion that, with early intervention, young criminals could be reformed. However, in practice, reformatories were used for children considered to need stronger discipline than those directed to their other types of institutions or to foster care. So the first Australian reformatory was Point Pure in Tasmania, which opened in 1834 for boys who had been transported from Britain. Britain wanted to remove children from their overcrowded welfare institutions and provide them with farming or domestic skills. And after the war, this policy assisted empire settlement, which aimed to increase the white Australian population with British-born citizens. Children often came from disadvantaged families and were sent to Australia without the parents' knowledge or consent. At least 500,000 children were believed to have been placed in out-of-home care during this time, consisting of forgotten Australians, members of the stolen generations, and child migrants. In Tasmania, the language in legislation was around training rather than reform. The colony passed the Training Schools Act in 1867. Training schools were an attempt to separate children who were considered neglected from those considered to be delinquent. Neglected children were placed in an industrial school or the boarding out system, while others were sent to a training school. In reality, the difference was not clear-cut, and children who were state wards because of neglect might be placed in a training school because they were difficult to manage or had absconded. The Pier Point Reformatory closed in 1849, and another boys' reformatory opened in a female factory at Cascades, South Hobart, in 1869. It was run by volunteers and provided an alternative to jail for boys about school age who were homeless or had broken the law. This reformatory closed in 1876. So the Destitute Children's Act, better known as the Industrial Schools Act, was passed through the Parliament of New South Wales in an effort to control wayward or destitute children. It was initiated following the findings of a select committee estimating that there was up to 1,000 destitute children in Sydney alone, and recommended the establishment of reformatory schools to get them off the streets. Fears of an urban underclass manifest in select communities into intemperance and into the condition of the working classes in the 1850s, which led to the foundation of industrial schools and the Asylum for Destitute Children, both public charities run by committees of citizens. At the time, a good society was based on the family, the church, and consequent stability. The child savers believed children from urban slums could become more upright, respectable citizens if transported to rural areas at an early age. The schools were designed on industrial schools in England, which would remove children who were homeless, involved in crime, or neglected in some way, and place them in reformatories, separating them from the bad influences that they were under. Once saved, the children could then be given a rudimentary education, taught the basics of a trade, and be apprenticed out to start their lives as useful citizens. Some of the first reformatories were on board ships, and the establishment of these nautical school ships was a response to the Destitute Children's Act. An ex-Navy sailing ship called the Vernon was the first in New South Wales to be converted into a training ship as a legal industrial reformatory. This was encouraged by Sir Henry Parkes, the then Premier of New South Wales. Now, he pops up quite a few times in these historical stories, as we saw in the School of Arts episode. Sir Henry Parkes, GCMG, 1815 to 1896, was a colonial Australian politician. The Vernon housed boys who were destitute, neglected, or in moral danger and had not committed any criminal offence. However, it became common practice for children who were believed to have committed crimes to be sentenced by magistrates to the Vernon when no other reformatory schools for young offenders was available at the time. In 1891, another ship called the Soberon was brought in Melbourne by the colonial government of New South Wales to be used as another reformatory school, and so modifications were made to fit the ship out for use. The Soberon had been carrying large numbers of passengers and cargoes between England and Australia, and was 3 times the size of the Vernon. It housed more than 200 boys at a time, rather than just 500 in all. Alexander Hort and Co. built the ship in Aberdeen, Scotland, 1866, as the passenger clipper, and was the largest composite hull sailing vessel ever built. It sailed on an annual migration run between England and Australia until becoming home and centre for thousands of boys for the next 20 years, who were comfortably accommodated, taught discipline, and learned trade and other skills that would enable them to find good employment. Both ships became anchored off Cockatoo Island in Sydney Harbour, and they combined a system of education and military-style discipline discipline based on a reformist vision. So, Cockatoo Island, known as Werrimaa, holds little resemblance to the uninhabited, rocky, tree-covered island it was before 1839, when the British Governor George Gipps decided to build a convict jail on it. The wooded slopes were cleared, the upper parts levelled for the construction of prison barracks, and its sandstone foreshores were blasted with gunpowder to construct a dry dock. The largest island in Sydney Harbour increased from 12.9 to 17.9 hectares. There is an online article about the island issued by the Freemason magazine named Sydney's Most Surprising Island. Under the guidance of Superintendent Frederick William Nietenstein from 1878 to 1895, military-style drills were introduced to the boys. Their days on board were divided in two, with lessons taking up one half of the day and drill taking up the other half. The boys were under constant supervision, with inspections being a means to ensure they stayed on the right path. The boys were further controlled through a class system of 7 grades, with each grade carrying privileges and work routines. Boys worked on a mark system to advance to higher grades, receiving the extra privileges that went with them. By encouraging advancement, the system was designed to maintain discipline and ensure self-reliance, both seen as being essential to reform. The boys of the Vernon and the Soberon maintained a small farm to supply themselves with fresh food, and this was a practice which continued at the Gosford farm home. Meanwhile, the Carpentaria Reformatory was established in Eastwood at Dundas, near Parramatta, in 1894 by the Department of Charitable Institutions, and was later taken over by the State Children's Relief Department, being renamed Brush Farm in 1908. The Department of Charitable Institutions was a New South Wales government agency established in 1888 that took over the responsibilities of the Inspector of Public Charities, who was a person appointed by the New South Wales government under the Public Institutions Inspection Act 1866 to inquire into the management of all hospitals, infirmaries, orphan schools and charitable institutions that received government funds. It administered state hospitals and asylums for the infirm, having overall responsibility for the State Children's Relief and Government Asylums branches. It oversaw the Children's Protection Act until 1901, when that responsibility was passed to the State Children's Relief Department, which was then transferred to the Department of Public Instruction in 1905. In 1911, this department became the Metropolitan Hospitals and Charities Department. So Brush Farm was predominantly for boys aged 14 to 16 years old and quickly became overcrowded with boys convicted of offences. It had a separate division that was made up of 40 boys from Rydalmere Probationary Home who were considered too vicious to be kept in ordinary homes. The farm was investigated by Frederick Nietenstein, the former superintendent of the Soberon, whose intentions were to turn prison into a moral hospital and sought to remove first offenders, inebriates, juveniles, lunatics, and summary offenders from the inmate population. Only real criminals were to be subjected to the new reformative regime. Brush Farm was sometimes called the Shore Reformatory, as it was the land counterpart of the Ship Reformatory. The boys also dressed in naval uniforms, slept in hammocks, and rang a ship's bell, and the superintendent's office was referred to as the quarter deck. Detention at this reformatory was for 9 months, considerably shorter than the 3 years favoured by the Department of Public Instruction for its reformatories and industrial schools. A school was provided on site. In 1909, the Cumberland Argus and Fruit Growers Advocate reported that 5 boys aged 15 to 16 years had escaped from the Carpentaria Reformatory. 3 were caught in the railway station waiting room at Mount Coolah, while 2 got as far as the Hawkesbury before giving themselves up to police. One was described as a very clever lad, and the boys, knowing descriptions of their clothes would be circulated, had managed to hide some other garments before making their escape. They all returned to the reformatory. So we can see in the map here, Mount Coolah is here, and Mount Peneng is here. So that's, yeah, a little distance. In 1911, the New South Wales government decided to transfer the Nautical Ship Reformatory program to the facility onshore at Mount Peneng, near Carryong. Yeah, that's where Brush Farm is. So the boys escaped from Brush Farm here, were caught at Mount Coolah here, and the Mount Peneng Reformatory was located here. So yeah, it's kind of halfway. Anyway, the ship venue as reformatory was becoming outdated and expensive, and numbers of boys had declined since most had been transferred to other reformatories or apprenticed out to families. Also, the Reformatory and Industrial Schools Act became the Neglected Children's and Juvenile Offenders Act 1905, including probation, and under this act it was that the Gosford farm home was built. The boys from Brush Farm Reformatory were also moved to the Gosford farm home to help build the farm, and Brush Farm closed in 1912. The Sovereign was then commissioned to the Royal Australian Navy in 1912 and turned into a training establishment for thousands of boys seeking a career in the new Navy. So, according to Book 1 of Masonry on the Central Coast, in November 1911, Masonic members had left or passed away, and so the local solicitor Macpherson advertised meetings to be held at Oddfield Hall on Donison Street, Gosford, to keep the flame going. On finding that a group of delinquent boys had come to settle on the Carryong Plateau under pioneer educators for rehabilitation and had built their own cabins, they met up to replant the seed to keep masonry going in the district. The superintendent of the boys' farm home at Mount Peneng, Fred Stainer, was the foundation master of the Masonic Rising Sun Lodge in 1911 and a member of the lodge. Herbert Charles Wood was a former probation officer of the Nautical School ship and became probation officer of the boys' home in 1922. So this is the Medal of the Order of the Rising Sun. It's a Japanese order created in 1875 by decree of the Council of State. The badge features rays of sunlight from the rising sun. Design of the rising sun symbolized energy as powerful as the rising sun, in parallel with the rising sun concept of Japan, land of the rising sun. That's where that came from. So, a probation and parole officer is an official appointed or sworn to investigate, report on, and supervise the conduct of convicted offenders on probation or those released from incarceration to community supervision, such as parole. Most probation and parole officers are employed by the government of the jurisdiction in which they operate. although some are employed by private companies that provide contracted services to the government. This is a clip from the British TV series that ran from 1959 to 1962. It was this called Probation Officer, and I thought I would just insert this here to show you.
Oh dear, I shot Mr. May. Oh, well, next to the grindstone, as my old mate used to say. Cheerio, Jim. It's a great life, you don't weaken. See you around. Well, is it decent enough bunch? Ah, they're all right. Delman says they got it in for me. You afraid they're right? I wish I could say otherwise. What about Miss Oh, no. Oh, no, I've said too much already. You even thought of the rest of yourself. Only just because we're probation officers, don't think we're past the things. Maybe we ought to be, but we are not.
Okay, I'll leave that there. So on the 1st of July 1912, a party of approximately 100 boys aged between 10 and 16 began clearing the 700-acre site at Mount Peneng near Gosford in order to build the new state-controlled farm under the supervision of Probation Officer Herbert Wood. So on this map here is Gosford City, and here is the site of Mount Peneng, where the farm home was situated. The land was on the lip of a reasonably flat summit of a sharp escarpment 3 miles west of the town of Gosford, and was isolated from main population centres, which is a requirement that had worked against the brush farm site at Eastwood that had been encroached upon by residential development. It was the combination of these factors of inaccessibility and isolation that led the committee appointed to locate the new site to choose Mount Peneng. This decision was also influenced by the perceived need for agricultural labourers in New South Wales, which made a rural site with agricultural potential attractive. Although remoteness worked in favour of the choice of the Mount Peneng site for the farm, it did create some serious problems during the construction of the complex. So, access to the proposed site at Mount Peneng provided the first obstacle that needed to be overcome. The only access to the building site was via a steep track, with all the equipment and stores being brought in by bullock. Bricks were ruled out as the main building material due to the difficulties of transportation and associated costs. From the inception of the project, a building committee was established to oversee the construction and to work through any potential difficulties. As an alternative to bricks, the committee recommended the use of local hardwood and sandstone that would be quarried on site. The building committee architect, James Nangle, also recommended the use of concrete for the buildings, which would reduce costs and overcome the problem of transport. So that's a bit about James Nangle. From 1868 to 1941, all of these letters after his name. An architect, a renowned educator, and accomplished amateur astronomer, he had worked as an architect in Sydney since 1891, being employed in the design of residential, commercial, and industrial projects. He had worked with the Department of Public Instruction on the design of portable classrooms, and his association with the department was further strengthened through his teaching in the technical education branch from 1890 to the late 1930s. From 1913, he was the superintendent of the branch, being instrumental in its move towards a more vocationally orientated approach. The Minister of Public Instruction approved the plans with a budget set as £12,000 for the main structures, with the boys providing the labour as another cost-cutting measure. On site, the boys lived in military-style bell tents and were also supervised by staff member Frederick Stainer from the Brush Farm Reformatory. They worked on the construction of their own dormitories and were split into work parties under the supervision of tradesmen who could provide assistance and guidance. They cleared forest and built dormitories, staff quarters, and mess rooms. This was hard, uncomfortable work, but was seen as essential to the reform and development of the boys. Their life consisted of farm work, with some rudimentary training and skills like boot making, and prayer, marching, and drills were all part of the routine. The first buildings to be constructed were the ones that were the most essential to the institution, such as the dormitories, a dining room, staff quarters, offices, a kitchen, storerooms for supplies and equipment, and accommodation for the tradesmen and clerk of works. The Minister of Public Instruction laid the foundation stone of number 1 dormitory on December 1912. The dormitory was completed by September following year, as had the assistant superintendent's residence and 4 weatherboard cottages for the married staff members. These cottages still standing along the entrance road to the complex. The first schoolmaster at Mount Peneng, George Walpole, former teacher on the Soberon, kept a diary of his time there, which included the construction phase in 1912. Walpole noted that the concrete mix for the works was made up of 3 portions of crushed stone, 2 portions sand, and 1 portion cement mixture, all of which was mixed by the boys before being tipped into prepared boxing or framework to create the walls. As 2 groups mixed the concrete, another would convey to the site, while a 4th team lifting the boxing from the day before up the scaffolding to the next day's operation. In their spare time, mainly on Sundays when no construction work was undertaken, the boys developed a sports ground under Walpole's supervision, which was dedicated in 1912. A team of boys also opened up a mile-long drain using a road plough and sank a well 3.5 meters deep into the top an underground stream for fresh water. To tap an underground stream of fresh water. By 1914, Mount Peneng was dealing with all boy delinquents who had been institutionalized in New South Wales through the Children's Courts. In the Superintendent's report to the Minister for Public, year 1915, he set out the principle of the farm's work ethic thus: habits of steady industry are required, which are carried outside the boundaries of the institution and characterize the future conduct of many lads who before were inclined to settle down in any form of work, and herein lies the secret of reformation in many cases. Boys frequently are bad or delinquent, not from natural bent, but simply because they are lazy and have never been forced to work steadily at any occupation, requiring the expenditure of a certain amount of energy. In the same year, the superintendent reported that a second dormitory of a concrete reservoir, a store, and office had all been completed. The 2 dormitories were built either side of the household block, with the officers dwelling behind. This arrangement allowed for a suitable system in which to classify the inmates, as well as providing constant supervision. Other works on the site during this period included the construction of a windmill to pump water from a freshwater stream below the escarpment, 5 galvanized tanks for water storage, a carpentry workshop, a 300-yard trolley line for transporting the sandstone from the quarry to the site, and a bullock team and wagon, 2 horses, 2 spring carts, and 1 dray. The buildings were all roofed with corrugated iron. Also during this period, a permanent dam and concrete reservoir were completed, supplying the site with constant fresh water. Construction work continued at the site until 1922. The northern curved part of the avenue, along which several of Mount Penang Boys' Home's main buildings are still located, is thought to have been laid out around 1912 as part of the initial detention centre development. The southern straight part of the avenue is thought to have been laid out by slightly later, when attention turned to site landscaping. A row of box trees was planted at each side. It appears that the road had been constructed and the trees planted by 1938. It functioned as one of two main entryways into the site of what is now the Central Coast Highway. The avenue is now the site's main entry drive. The superintendent at Mount Penang during its formative years was Frederick Stainer. Stainer had been appointed to the Sovereign by the Department of Public Instruction in March 1894. From the Sovereign, he had been transferred to the Carpentarian Reformatory at Brush Farm, Eastwood, before moving with the boys to Mount Penang in 1912. His experience and training from the two former institutions was instrumental in the development of Mount Penang. Under his leadership, a number of significant administrative operations were implemented at the farm. The first major change was the introduction of an honour system, where extra privileges were awarded to the boys if they behaved within the guidelines set by the centre. As an incentive, the boys could shorten their time at the centre by advancing to probation based on the centre's honour system. Stainer organised a disciplinary system along a military line and teachers to carry or use canes without the direct authority of the superintendent. The emphasis of the centre was to be on the character development of the boys as opposed to an unnecessarily harsh regime. Competitive sports were also introduced, giving the inmates a sense of teamwork, as well as providing them with a regular exercise program. Schooling was also provided to the inmates on arrival at the centre. Boys were assessed to determine what level of education they had achieved. Each boy was required to reach a 4th class standard of primary school, regardless of age. Initially, the school operated in any building or verandas available to them. In the first years, schooling was conducted in the converted end of the new dormitory until a school building was erected behind the main complex. The syllabus was based on the 1905 primary syllabus. The Gosford Boys' Farm Home was officially opened in 1913. In 1923, the state government passed the Child Welfare Act, repealing and consolidating a variety of provisions that existed in legislation relating to the care and management of children under state protection. The Act was designed to place a much greater emphasis on children's health, welfare and rehabilitation under the direction of the newly created Child Welfare Department, with Walter Bethel, who had been instrumental in setting up Mount Penang, as secretary. The new act dealt with juvenile offenders who had come through the children's courts up to the age of 16, or those between 16 and 18 on minor charges in the adult system. The distinction reflected the government's recognition of the need for more lenient treatment of young people under state care, away from the harsh environment of the New South Wales criminal justice system. Under the new system, the Gosford Farm Home was classified as an industrial school, with the schooling component being controlled by the Department of Education. That's the Department of Education building. In 1925, the newly formed Main Roads Board began construction on the Pacific Highway. This work, completed in 1913, made road travel to the Gosford area much easier than previous. Further improvements such as replacement of the Hawkesbury River car ferries with a new road bridge in 1945 led to a rapid increase in the numbers of day trippers to the Central Coast. An inquiry was conducted by the Children's Court into allegations of mistreatment of the boys at Mount Peneng. Part of the findings of the 1923 report was that there had been undue severity in some punishments at Mount Peneng, and it recommended a lessening of the use of the cane by officers working there. The Child Welfare Department in 1930 set out the principles behind the Gosford Training School in the annual report. The elder boys are admitted, and by a process of character building consisting of drill and individual training based on each boy's psychological peculiarities, through successive grades or classifications in the institution until it is thought they are once more fit for a trial on conditional discharge. As regards to the future, it is intended to develop the training of the boys to a greater degree in manual work, particularly in regard to working in wood and metal. Also, to make some training possible for wards over 14 years of age before apprenticing them to employers. It also describes some of the routine and the work the boys did. On admission, a lad is allotted to number 1 company, which occupies number 1 dormitory, and he has to earn his transfer from there up to number 4 company and dormitory before he is considered as ready for release on probation. The training consists of orchard, farm and dairy work, road making, levelling, clearing, tree felling and other work incidental to a farm. A manual training class is in operation, and each lad must take part in organised physical training and sport and learn to swim. A second inquiry in 1934 investigated the punishment regime more closely and found that it was common practice for more senior boys to administer punishment to junior inmates. In 1934, this type of punishment often went unsupervised by staff and was open to serious abuse. One example of these forms of punishment had the offender being required to fight up to 5 other boys with or without gloves. The fight continued until it was deemed that offender had received sufficient punishment. The annual report in 1932 had noted the effects of the Depression on the boys entering the training school, admitting that the cause of the failure of most of the recidivist boys was their bad home conditions. It described the bodily effects of the Depression. Many of the lads admitted during these years were in poor physical condition, many of them suffering from malnutrition, and steps had to be taken to build them up to the standard of health maintained by the department. Many of them had been roaming the country looking for work and had endured severe privation. As a result, on admission, they were weakened in physique. The regime at Gosford was condemned by the inquiry held in 1934 by J. E. McCulloch. J. E. McCulloch was an economist and author known for his 1924 book, Home, the Saviour of Civilization, which emphasized the importance of the home in shaping children's values and character. McCulloch reported that the punishment regime at Gosford included allowing the older boys to administer corporal punishment to the younger boys without supervision by staff. This included older boys forming a gauntlet through which the boys under punishment were obliged to run while the older boys hit them. The staff were untrained, and some McCulloch considered were mentally unstable. McCulloch also observed the staff allowed boys to work in unsafe situations, such as standing on the edge of giant coppers to boil laundry. The regime does appear to have changed after McCulloch's report. Between 1923 and 1940, the living conditions and amenities at the centre gradually improved. An ongoing building program ensured that the boys continued to get building experience that could be used on their release, while at the same time upgrading their present conditions. In 1936, electric lighting and a hot water system were installed, which was followed in 1937 by a refrigeration service. By the end of 1937, the centre comprised 4 dormitories, a recreation hall that catered for concerts and movies, a dining and kitchen block, a hospital, a bathing and sanitary block, as well as a variety of outbuildings, including a dairy and accommodation for single and married staff. A farm was established on government land at Narara, about 16 kilometres from the centre. Due to the relatively poor quality of the soil at Mount Peneng, 31 boys were transferred to clear the land and prepare it for cultivation. A vegetable garden at Narara provided for the requirements of both the Narara and Gosford centres. However, the Narara farm was closed in April 1934, following the opening of a much larger institution at Bury in the same year. All the while, pasture improvement was being undertaken at Gosford, with sufficient milk being produced for the centre's purpose. However, as farm training was now offered elsewhere, more emphasis was made on vocational training at Gosford from this time. The Narara Arboretum is a historic arboretum located within Strickland State Forest near Narara on the central coast of New South Wales, Australia. It's known for its diverse collection of trees, including native and exotic species, some dating back to the late 19th and 20th centuries. The Arboretum is a popular spot for bushwalking, with trails like the Arboretum Loop Trail offering scenic routes through rainforest and past notable tree specimens. The Narara Eco Village is also located in the area, preserving the natural heritage of the site. So I'm wondering if this is about the site where the boys worked, which became the agricultural soil, and the Arboretum was particularly around that time, so I thought there might have been a connection there. As part of this program, further interaction with the local community in Gosford was encouraged. The institution wanted to make the local community more aware of the farm home, thereby giving a level of acceptance. This was to be achieved through a number of initiatives. For example, sporting teams were organised at the centre to play in the local competitions, including football, cricket and athletics, which helped promote a positive self-image in the boys and improved relations with the local community. Further involvement came through the public use of the recreation hall to view the latest movies on the centre's own screen. The boys were also employed on community projects in and around Gosford. Maintenance, gardening and small construction jobs could be carried out by the boys, which helped develop a sense of civic pride and responsibility among the inmates. In May 1944, a new sub-institution was opened at Mount Peneng by the then Minister for Education and Child Welfare, Clive Rayley Evatt, OC, 1900 to 1984, was an Australian politician, barrister and raconteur. Built at an initial cost of £25,000, it was originally designed as a maximum security sub-institution for unresponsive boys, but after 1948 it became a privileged cottage, representing a shift in governmental policy in child welfare. The changes in government policies generally sought to move away from the authoritarian structures and harsh discipline that was associated with reform schools towards a more open, family-style environment. It was an earlier example of some kind of thinking that had led to the establishment of the Gosford Farm Home for Boys, establishing a smaller scale, more personalised type of institution. Also in 1944, a new superintendent, Vincent Heffernan, was appointed. Heffernan had been an executive officer of the National Emergency Service during the war years and brought with him a new sense of purpose for the centre. Heffernan noticed that by the mid-1940s, the centre was in a dilapidated state, both physically and ideologically. The honour system that had been introduced under Stainer had deteriorated, and discipline had become more and more rigid. In addition to this, the pastures were in poor condition, as were both the pigs and cattle. Of further concern was the state of the various workshops and schoolhouse. Between 1944 and 1947, Heffernan set about reinvigorating the institution, buying new equipment for the trade rooms, establishing a boot shop to supply shoes, upgrading the pastures, and raising the pigs and cows to stud standard. A new dairy and stock shed were also constructed as part of the upgrade. The construction of new recreational facilities, including new playing fields, bowling greens, and a tennis court, as well as extensive landscaping and planting, were also begun during this period. From the 1940s, Mount Peneng began to show their livestock, winning a number of prizes at local events and the Royal Easter Show in Sydney. Although many of Australia's institutions for young offenders began as reformatories, in the mid-20th century the language began to change, and these places began to be called youth training centres, training institutions, and later juvenile justice centres. This renaming reflected established changes that the vast majority of children and young people under state control were not given custodial sentences, and that this type of institution had more clearly become a youth arm of the criminal justice system. In 1946, the name of the institution was changed from the Farm Home for Boys, Gosford, to Mount Peneng Training School for Boys, Gosford. The reason behind the name change was that the new name more clearly represented the idea that a varied program of planned training was required for the re-education and rehabilitation of delinquent youth. The application of the name Mount Peneng was favoured over some of the other established names for the area, such as Carryong, as it had not been applied to any other institution or building. There were a few escapees from the Gosford home, and these were published in the newspapers. This one, the Sydney Daily Mirror, 1942. It reads, "Taking French leave, 13 inmates of the Gosford Training School decamped today. It was the largest batch of inmates to leave the institution for some years. The school is a reception house for delinquents punished in the children's court, and although there are periodical escapes, the boys are usually rounded up by the police and given additional detention by the courts." Another one, 1942. 7 youths escaped from Gosford Boys' Home yesterday. Local police are making a search. And then escape plot at Gosford failed. In this article, in 1945, it reads, "An attempt to escape by boys at the Gosford farm home was defeated when an instructor quickly recovered from a blow on the head and warned the guard patrolling the grounds. The instructor, H. Wall, 55, was in an all-night vigil guarding 60 boys in a dormitory when he was struck from behind with a piece of iron piping. A large-scale escape had been planned. Wall was to be knocked out and robbed of a sum of money, which he was reported always to carry. The keys to the dormitory door were to be taken from his pocket. Boys were to dash out of the institution. Wall had head injuries, which required several stitches. Another one, 1946. Boy escaped from Gosford. Escaping from the Gosford farm home for delinquent boys, now known as the Mount Peneng Training School, a 17-year-old inmate was still at large. Tonight, police expect him to make for Sydney. And 4 Gosford boys escape. Again, 1946. 4 inmates of the Mount Peneng Training School escaped from the institution last night. In the Gosford Children's Court this morning, another absconder who had previously been charged with escaping was sent to jail for 3 months for having broken out of the home. So escapees became known as dingoes, and if someone had escaped, they were described as going dingo. Reformatories were strictly gendered, with girls controlled by female staff, boys by males. Mount Peneng was the main reformatory for boys, and the Parramatta Industrial School became the main reformatory for girls. Parramatta was the largest institution in New South Wales for girls, and rates as one of the worst children's institutions in Australian history. Inmates were a mix of juvenile offenders, girls charged with exposure to moral danger, and those deemed generally uncontrollable, although they had done nothing wrong. These were victims of abuse, with nowhere else to turn to but the state's care and protection, where they would spend up to 12 months in the worst possible environment for a child. Australia has a long and horrific history of institutional child abuse. 9 of the worst children's homes in New South Wales are the Parramatta Girls Training School and Hay Institute, Darug Boys Home, Tamworth Institution for Boys, Royalston Boys Home, Mittagong Training School for Boys, Berry Training Farm, St Vincent's Westmead, North Coast Children's Home, Lismore, and Gill Memorial and Bexley Salvation Army Homes. In May 1948, the new Minister for Education, Bob Heffron, opened a converted detention cottage as a privilege cottage, renamed McCabe Cottage in 1976, in line with the new government thinking. Robert James Heffron, 1890 to 1978, also known as Bob Heffron or R.J. Heffron. He was a politician, union organiser, and Australian Labor Party Premier of New South Wales from 1959 to 1964. Heffron became involved in various socialist and labour movements. He was jailed for conspiracy to strike action, but later elected into the Parliament in 1930. The building was redecorated internally, and boys were allowed their own room. Although still supervised, the atmosphere was more relaxed than in the main centre. Adjacent to the cottage, 2 residences were also built to house visiting families, further reinforcing the Reformation ideal. McCabe Cottage represented a new level of privilege at the centre. From the opening of Mount Peneng, boys had had an opportunity to improve their position at the centre by showing that they could be trusted. The remote location of McCabe Cottage from the main centre of Mount Penang reinforced the trust that the boys had gained from the institution. Since the 1940s, the greatest development in Gosford had been the growth of urbanisation in the eastern sector, brought about by road and rail improvements, an upsurge in secondary industries and state planning policies, which see Gosford as part of an expanding Sydney region. In recent times, the expansion of the metropolitan Sydney, the availability of private and public transport, and improved road systems have combined to change the development of Gosford from a rural community prior to World War II to that of a city containing some secondary and service industries related to the tourist trade. Agriculture and horticulture continue in the mountain areas, but in declining importance to employment and production. A survey of the former inmates of McCabe Cottage, conducted in the 1950s, found that of 62 boys who had passed through it, 7 had been returned to the main institution, 38 had been discharged, and 14 were still in residence. Only one of the discharged boys had been readmitted, and one had absconded. It seemed that the cottage was working in the rehabilitation of the boys and helping them make a successful adjustment to life in the community. In 1976, McCabe Cottage became a pre-discharge unit for the Justice Centre. In the 1950s, Mount Penang was divided into the main institution, which had dormitory-style accommodation, and the privileged cottage, which had separate bedrooms, dining and recreation rooms. There was a large-scale landscaping of the site, with the boys carrying out stonemasonry and land clearing. In 1959, it held 380 boys. According to the 1962 Child Welfare Department Annual Report, the grounds of the institution have been landscaped on a large scale, involving the removal of a sizable hill. Stone one in the process has been used to face the terraces and build walls and rock gardens. This work being carried out by the boys under trained supervision. The lads take great pride in their stonework, a number of them becoming remarkably expert in stonemasonry, a craft which is something of a dying art in the outside community. Each day was deliberately long and exhausting, and like similar regimes in girls' homes like Parramatta, was designed to effect personality changes. In 1964, Child Welfare Department described the policy: an inmate of Mount Penang is exposed to a regulated, demanding program from 6 a.m. until 9 p.m. in the course of each day. Therefore, he is brought into contact with varying influences depending on his location, which have a decided impact on his attitude, behavior, and character. Boys who did not comply with this regime or committed offences within Mount Penang were sent to an annex, Tamworth Institution for Boys, which was opened in 1948. In 1976, that institution was renamed Endeavour House. Both have been described by former inmates as a school for killers, as the boys sent there often headed into lives of violent crime. Although Mount Penang was not quite as brutal as Tamworth, it too had a reputation for creating rather than reforming criminals. Punishment for acts as simple as speaking out of turn or looking sideways at another person, was known as a bounce and could be anything from losing privileges or meals for a period of time to more violent punishments. During the 1960s, 5 new buildings were erected behind the administration building, and a new sports ground was built. The new buildings housed an assembly hall, a gymnasium, a new kitchen dining room, a laundry and boiler house, and a storeroom. The sports ground was defined in its northern boundary by this new collection of buildings. In 1960, the New South Wales government established a new institution called Darrick, described as an annex of Mount Peneng. Darrick's first residents were transferred from Mount Peneng. The Child Welfare Department regarded Darrick as an institution halfway between the Mittagong Training School and Mount Peneng, which was a more serious facility for delinquents. Boys who were sent to Darrick Boys' Home at Windsor experienced unimaginable abuse at the hands of their carers. In 1975, the new superintendent at Mount Peneng, Laurie Mao, implemented a building program aimed at providing the centre itself as well as the morale of the boys and staff. The first project in 1975 was internal modifications to the dormitories, with new and upgraded bathroom and toilet facilities being installed, providing more privacy for the boys. During the same year, a storeroom within the administration block was converted into a holding room. As well as renovations, a number of new buildings were constructed on the site during the 1970s and early 1980s. A new officers' dining room was built in 1976, adjacent to the boys' dining rooms, and a new office block which included offices for the superintendent, deputy superintendents, salary officer, a police interview room, a conference room, and general office, was erected in 1978. A new hospital block and nurses' quarters to replace the original 1920s hospital was also built during this phase, as was a new store and amenities building to the north of the gymnasium. In 1978, a 50-metre swimming pool was added to the recreational facilities at Mount Peneng, constructed on the site of a disused bowling green. The former clubhouse associated with the bowling green then converted to a teacher's staff room. In 1980, the school program was returned to the Education Department after having been controlled by the Child Welfare Department since 1953. A number of new programs were introduced to the school at this time, including a new program for boys who rebelled against the traditional methods and a remedial program for one-on-one teaching. In 1991, the school program was updated to a secondary level, having operated at a primary level since its beginning. Further to these changes, the school's name was changed to Girrakul, which is an Aboriginal word meaning place of still waters. This name is associated with the Girrakul area within Brisbane Water National Park, known for its serene and tranquil environment. It had been found that the former inmates were reluctant to use certificates which had Mount Peneng inscribed on them, due to the attached stigma. The new name eliminated this concern. The school itself was now a collection of demountable schoolrooms, with the 2 original buildings serving as a library and cultural centre. The centre was also often used as a place for immediately housing Aboriginal children removed from their families before they were assigned and relocated to other institutions. Mount Peneng Detention Centre in Kariong was the new name given in 1988 to what had been the Mount Peneng Training School for Boys, also known as Gosford Training Home. It was run by the Department of Family and Community Services. Mount Penang Detention Centre was transferred to the Department of Juvenile Justice and renamed Mount Penang Juvenile Justice Centre in 1991. In 1991, the last major building program was completed, with the opening of the Frank Baxter Carry-On Juvenile Justice Centre in 1999. This Juvenile Justice Centre was a purpose-built, high-security centre for those detainees with a history of escape or who had proved to be difficult to control in other centres, as well as those who had committed more serious offences on the edge of the former site. Lawrence Joseph Laurie Ma, OAM, became the Mayor of Gosford City Council between 2004 and 2012, and the CEO of Coast Shelter, a non-profit homelessness service assisting people in the Central Coast region. He later faced court over alleged misconduct committed at Mount Penang Training School and was charged for offences that took place between 1977 and 1988. The discipline and violence between detainees that previous inquiries had identified at Gosford emerged at Mount Penang. In 1991, the New South Wales Ombudsman, then David Lander, conducted an inquiry into the administration of Mount Penang. He found that the Department of Family and Community Services had failed to ensure that staff acted within the law, the Children Detention Centres Act, when dealing with minor and serious misbehaviour in the centre. According to the Ombudsman, staff had neglected their duties and there were systematic problems in the administration of the centre. The Ombudsman's inquiry was triggered by a 16-year-old boy who was put into the centre in 1989 and was serially harassed and assaulted by other detainees. The boy wrote to the Ombudsman for help. "I have nothing against this place. Actually, it's a good place with many helpful, useful facilities. Apart from the kids, it's all right. I've not asked for all this trouble. They like to scare and play tricks on the new kid. I've considered taking several desperate measures, one of which is running away and handing myself into a better detention centre, such as Ribi or Keelong. I believe I done the crime. I should do the time. These incidents are way out of hand and are unable to be fixed up." The incidents included being offered drugs, actually bleach, threatened with pack rape, hit on the head with a steel bar, bitten, cut, shoulder charged, assaulted in his own bed in front of a worker, burned with a cigarette, taunted homophobically, nearly drowned at a group swimming event, and being bashed so seriously that he was hospitalized twice. Another boy was hospitalized after a discharge bashing, which the Ombudsman described as a ritual of bastardization common in the centre. The Ombudsman found that the first boy was credible, and as he was a young, minor, non-violent offender who should not have been placed in Mount Penang to start with. He was highly critical of the superintendent, who ignored his complaints and found the staff allowed the boys to bash the detainee, rather than manage him properly. Administrative staff were prepared to condone the violence of the detainees on the first boy to fashion his behaviour rather than to set proper standards of conduct and maintain control of the establishment. This was against the regulations of the Department of Family and Community Services and the law, and the Ombudsman said would have recommended disciplinary action against the superintendent and the man not taken voluntary redundancy. The Ombudsman's report describes the state of the institution in October 1990. It was overcrowded. There were 184 boys when capacity was 160, and each dormitory had 40 beds, just 6 feet apart. The Ombudsman described the units as follows: Walpole, for sophisticated delinquents, the most secure unit. Vernon, for youth with interpersonal relationship problems, drug problems. Sobran for previous committals, Cariña for first committals, Stainer, drug and alcohol unit, and Wood, previous committals but not habitual offenders. Kariong Secure Unit existed alongside the home at this time. The Ombudsman found that overall 42% of detainees were aged 18 to 21 and were being held on serious and violent charges. He was skeptical about the classification of the boys and whether young, non-violent offenders could be cared for in such an environment. The report was handed down after the boy was transferred to another centre and after Mount Penang was removed from the Department of Family and Community Services. The administration of juvenile justice was transferred to the Department of Corrective Services in July 1991, and the Juvenile Justice Unit of the Department of Corrective Services became a separate administrative office in November 1991, named the Office of Juvenile Justice. Former residents have described the labour and harsh conditions which created the landscape at Mount Penang. The young men worked in a row, turning over the soil in a whole paddock with only shovels, digging one by one. One man recalled boys collapsing in the hot sun and being left there or moved under a tree and not receiving any water. Another man commented, "During the day we were made to either dig stones with a pickaxe from the paddock for a new oval, dig tree stumps out with pickaxes," calling it chain gang shit, really. One former resident spoke in 2014 about the violent physical and sexual assaults he received from officers at Mount Penang and said that the institution was more like a jail than a home. The boys who lived there referred to it as the pound. An independent public inquiry called the Royal Commission in Australia was established by the Governor-General to formally investigate matters of great public importance. It consisted of broad powers, public hearings, witness testimony under oath, and compelling evidence to make recommendations to government about necessary changes. The Royal Commission heard many accounts of sexual assaults on children at Darug. Consequently, the New South Wales Police established Strike Force Eckersley in 2016 to investigate. In 2021, 9 people have been charged as a result of this investigation, including the former Superintendent Laurie Marr. The Royal Commission spoke with multiple survivors of Darug Boys' Home in private sessions. The investigation prompted the New South Wales Government to privately apologise to the survivors of abuse for suffering caused by staff members at the institution. The Mount Penang Juvenile Justice Centre was added to the New South Wales State Heritage Register in 2003. And in the same year, Mount Penang Gardens became a tourist attraction on the Central Coast, designed by Anton James of JMD, James Mather Delaney, Landscape Architects. JMD Design seeks a creative synthesis between landscape architecture, engineering, visual arts, horticulture, and ecology. The works demonstrate a dynamic and sophisticated response, firmly grounded in a close attention to the existing site character. Anton, who trained as a landscape architect and visual artist, has over a period of 20 years designed projects in Australia, Europe, and the USA. The site of Mount Penang Juvenile Justice Centre, which currently has 2 juvenile justice facilities, is part of the Mount Penang Parklands Precinct, a Central Coast destination for tourism, events, business, and education, containing parks and gardens, a high school, an events park, commercial and office space, and residential development. The Frank Baxter Juvenile Justice Centre opened in 1999 and is the largest youth justice centre in New South Wales, holding up to 120 males aged 16 to 21, mostly on control orders. It attracted attention of the news in 2019 after almost a dozen inmates spent the night on the roof in a 17-hour standoff and which raised concerns the state's juvenile justice system was unsafe for workers. The Department of Public Instruction, which was created in 1880 as a government department responsible for education in New South Wales, is now known as the Department of Education.